Over 300,000 young Canadians fought in Europe during World War I. Over 60,000 died, killed in action or by unhealed wounds or disease. Surprisingly, among these Canadians were a handful of recent immigrants from India. 10 of them were Sikhs from the Punjab. At the time they enlisted, the Sikhs were not welcomed by Canadians. They could not vote or bring their families to Canada. Why would these men volunteer to fight for a country that denied them even the basic rights of citizenship? This is their newly discovered story, a story of research and strange and wonderful connections. In 1914, young men across Canada enlisted in their hometowns and went parading off to a war that most thought would only last for a few months. This crucible of war was a time of nation building for Canada, as politicians and military leaders struggled to cast off Canada's image as a colony of Great Britain. Within this young Canadian army, there were other struggles in nation building, as immigrants to Canada tried to show their dedication to their adoptive country by enlisting. Japanese Canadians tried, unsuccessfully, to form their own regiment. Chinese Canadians signed up with various units across Canada. Some of these immigrant stories have been well documented, but the story of this handful of Sikh immigrants to Canada who fought in World War I as part of the Canadian Army has never before been told. Historian David Gray discovered their story while researching another, and has spent the last 5 years piecing together this little story in a big war.
I first discovered that Sikh immigrants had fought for Canada in World War I while trying to find the names of 40 Sikhs who came to British Columbia in 1906 and worked at a limestone quarry and a cement factory near Victoria. I was searching the records of Canada's soldiers of the First World War at the National Archives of Canada, just in case one of the quarry workers had enlisted in World War I. And there I found that 8 immigrant men from India, all with the surname Singh, had enlisted in the Canadian Army.
History records that over 100,000 Sikh soldiers from India fought in France during World War I and participated in many of the war's major battles. In 1914, at the beginning of the war, there were about 2,000 Sikhs living in Canada. New immigration restrictions actively prevented more Sikhs from immigrating to Canada. Those who had arrived earlier were still denied Canadian citizenship. Many Sikhs had decided to leave Canada, and the population had dropped from about 5,000 in the early 1900s, so it's difficult to understand why, under these conditions, that any Sikh man would have joined the Canadian Army to fight in Europe. There were over 50 men born in India who enlisted in the Canadian Army in World War I. Most of them were of British origin. Only 12 were of Indian descent. Of these 12 men, 1 was Muslim, 1 probably Hindu, and the 10 others, most with the surname Singh, were Sikhs. The Canadian military records of these 10 men provide the thread for a unique story of service, discipline, and cultural clash, set against the tragic background of the Great War.
The story was an unknown aspect of early Canadian Sikh history. It was also something of a puzzle. Why had these men enlisted for Canada when clearly they were not welcomed in this country? The telling of this story also became a challenge. Could I find enough information on 10 men in an army of thousands? Would there be photographs of them? Would there be personal stories to accompany the sparse military records?
The initial research in the World War I military records in Canada's National Archives provided the basics. The soldiers' attestation papers completed at the time of enlistment, gives information on the address, age, place of birth, next of kin, previous service, and religion. As the list of names filled out with these details, the 10 names became people, individuals with complex lives of interest. Sunta Gugar Singh enlisted in Montreal in January 1915. He had served for 3 years in the Punjab Rifles of the Indian Army. Buckham Singh enlisted in Toronto in April 1915. At 22 years old, he was the youngest of the 10 men who enlisted. Harry Singh, caretaker, enlisted in Toronto in July 1915. His personal identification mark was a scar from a wolf bite on his left shoulder. Lashman Singh, labourer, enlisted in Smith Falls, Ontario in September 1915. His name was variously given as Lol Singh and Lal Singh in his military records. John Singh, farm labourer, enlisted in Winnipeg in January 1916. He walked with a limp and was the oldest of the 10 at 35 years. John Babu enlisted in Winnipeg in January 1916. He had his name tattooed on his arm and was married to an Irish woman from the USA. Warriam Singh, labourer, enlisted in Barriesfield, Ontario in May 1916. He belonged to the Sikh temple in Vancouver. Harnam Singh, a sawmill worker, enlisted in Vancouver in October 1916. His attestation paper states that he was born in Mexico, though his parents were from India and he had a wife in India. Ram Singh enlisted in Vancouver, but apparently never joined his regiment. He worked in a nursery in Grand Forks, British Columbia. Sua Singh worked in a Vancouver sawmill. He enlisted in Vancouver in June 1918. Most of these men very likely could not read or write English, and their signatures on their attestation papers ranged from a simple X to legible handwriting. The forms completed when the men enlisted suggest that the religion recorded had more to do with the enlistment officer's perceptions than the actual religion of the enlisting man. The religious denomination of 5 of the 10 Sikh men was recorded as Church of England. For example, though Warriam Singh's attestation paper gives his religion as being Church of England, another form in his military file indicates his religion as Hindu, and a third tells us that he was associated with the 2nd Avenue Sikh Temple in Vancouver. Sua Singh's religion is blank on the original attestation paper, but Buddhist is written in on a second form. John Singh's religion was correctly recorded as being associated with the Sikh temple. In his military will, he bequeathed all his estate to his church, the 2nd Avenue Sikh Temple in Vancouver.
Because of the obvious difficulty in trusting the assessed religion of these men, as recorded on the attestation papers, we had to look beyond to other ways of knowing who actually was of the Sikh faith. Sometimes we found the soldiers' religion in other records, like medical and even death records. Though the military records did provide many details, unfortunately there were no photographs. Group photos of military units are usually large, and it is difficult to spot individuals. We could only speculate. Could this man be one of the Sikh soldiers? Or this one? However, from this beginning, we began to know these men, to understand something of their background, and to see how their individual wartime experiences fit into the larger story of the Great War.
Of the 10 Canadian soldier Sikhs identified, 8 served and fought on the battlegrounds of France and Belgium. These 8 men were involved in several important battles, and 2 received good conduct stripes for their actions. 5 were wounded, 2 were killed in action, and 1 died of his injuries after he returned to Canada. The military records and war diaries of the units the men served in give the general view of the actions they witnessed and were involved in. Sunta Gugar Singh was the first casualty. He was killed in action early in the war in the trenches near Kamel, Belgium, just south of Ypres, in October 1915. Buckham Singh was the first of our soldiers to be wounded. In June 1916, he suffered a scalp wound as a result of being hit by shrapnel at Vimy Ridge. And a month later, at St. Elo, a bullet fractured his leg just below the knee. He returned to the battlefield twice, after recovery in British hospitals. Harry Singh of the Royal Canadian Dragoons was wounded in the back by an exploding shell in France, at Vimy Ridge on April 1, 1917. He returned to duty on the front lines in France after 6 months.
The basic military records gave us some initial insights into the lives of the Sikh men, and the medical records certainly provided personal medical details. But we really wanted to find a personal story, to see their own words, or to really hear the voices of these soldiers. And with the persistence of historical research, we did. This was one of the most exciting moments in the search, the discovery of 3 letters written by one of the Canadian Sikh soldiers. When soldier William Singh wrote letters home to India in 1916, 3 of his letters were intercepted by the censor of the Indian Army mails and translated into English for censoring. We knew from a colleague that there was a letter from a Canadian soldier Sikh quoted in a publication somewhere, but finding it took a major bit of searching. We finally tracked down the reference and discovered that the original letter was held in the British Library in London, England. The letter was buried along with thousands of similar letters from soldiers in the Indian Army in 9 volumes of letters translated by the Indian Army Censor's Office. It was an exciting challenge to find the known letter, and even more exciting to discover 2 additional letters from the same man.
William Singh's first letter was written to his brother, Indar Singh, in Kapurthala, India, in November 1916. Like so many others, he was then hopeful of the war ending soon.
I believe this war will soon be decided. You know that there is frost in this part of Europe? What can I say? The frost or rain falls every day, and the mud is beyond description, and the war is terrible. The Germans are war-weary, and I could write a lot about their bad condition, but time will not allow. On the 13th and 14th of November, 3,000 to 4,000 prisoners were brought into the trenches. In 2 days, the British Army made all these prisoners, and the French made 3,000. The treacherous German is, however, very hard to convince that he is beaten. I am hopeful that he will soon be crushed.
The second letter from William is to his father, Wazir Singh, in Kapurthala.
I should like to tell you all about what happened on November 18, but I am not allowed to write. I can only give you some idea of what happened. On the 4th of November, there was a big fight, and much hand-to-hand fighting took place, and many prisoners were taken. Shells and bullets were falling like rain, and one's body trembled to see what was going on. But when the order came to advance and take the enemy's trench, it was wonderful how we all forgot the danger and were filled with extraordinary resolution. We went over like men walking in a procession at a fair, and shouting, we seized the trench and took the enemy prisoners. When we took the trenches, some of the enemy escaped and some were taken. The dead were countless. The bravery which we showed that day was the admiration of the British soldiers. After the fight, they asked me how it was that I was so utterly regardless of danger.
William Singh's third letter, written to his father on December 11, 1916, tells more about the soldiers' life away from the battle lines, and about the interactions with the French families they were billeted with.
There is another thing that I wish to tell you, though the telling be profitless. He is a fool who says anything in his own praise, so forgive me. I do not tell it to exalt myself, but simply by way of relating an experience. It concerns the conditions of affairs in the house in which we are billeted when we are resting. You know that in every house there are children and sisters, and you know also that the behavior of soldiers is uncertain. In 100 there are about 5 really good men. The rest are very indifferent, whatever the class from which they come. One day, hearing their coarse badinage and seeing their drinking to excess of intoxicant liquors, I could not restrain myself, and I told them that it was not seemly for them to behave in this way, adding that they should pass the days honorably. In fact, I reproached them well. The officers and everyone else know that I never touch strong drink and live cleanly, and for this reason my comrades listened to me and acted on my advice. Consequently, the people of the house thereafter treated me with much consideration and respect.
4 months after his last intercepted letter home, Warriam Singh was wounded in the shoulder at the end of April 1917. He remained on duty despite his wound, but then he also got trench fever and pneumonia and spent almost 8 months in the hospital in France and England. He also underwent an operation on his shoulder because the wound had not healed. Harnam Singh of the Railway Construction Battalion was wounded during the fighting of January 1918, but he too remained on duty in spite of his wound. It was not unusual for Canadian soldiers to object to the discipline of the traditional British military system, and the Canadian Sikhs were no exception. With the additional barriers of language and culture, 4 of the Sikh Canadians were disciplined for various offences, including losing an item of kit and being away without leave. Harnam Singh was charged for neglecting to obey an order and insolence to a non-commissioned officer. Lashman Singh was disciplined for striking a superior officer in January 1918, 9 months before he was killed in action.
The story of Lashman Singh's court-martial is preserved in a World War I database in Canada's National Archives. Finding the court-martial records and discovering that Lashman's own words in his defense were recorded was of major importance to our story.
I came to France with the battalions in August 1916 and have always tried to be a good soldier and to do my best. Since coming to France, I have had only 2 minor charges against me and had none before that. I enlisted in September 1915. I produced my discharge certificate from the Indian Army, where I served for 3 years and 3 months and was discharged with a very good character. When I returned from my leave to Paris, Sergeant Major Barlow saw some money in my pocket and accused me of having stolen 20 francs of his. I said I had not done so, and the matter was brought up before an officer. The sergeant major put me on the extra guard duty after that, but we went up to the front line almost immediately, so I did not do extra guard. I never stole any money, but I have always since felt under suspicion. On the 13th of November, I was ordered to change my billet from a billet occupied by 4 to one occupied by 20. I asked the sergeant major why I should go, and he did not reply. I then said, why should I pay 20 francs and why should I go? The sergeant major then had me placed in the guard room. I did not go into the kitchen where the sergeant major was, and I did not hit him.
The court-martial found Lashman Singh guilty of striking a superior officer and using insubordinate language to a superior officer. He was given 90 days in detention. Partway through his detention, he was taken to hospital suffering from an infected face. He spent 2 months in the General Military Hospital in France and returned to his battalion in May 1918. Along with his comrades in the 75th Battalion, Lashman took part in several important actions, including the crossing of the Canal du Nord and Rai. Lashman Singh was killed in action late in the war, in October 1918, at or near the town of Belang, France, where the Canadians were driving back the German army with a ferocious but costly success that soon brought the war to an end. Buckam Singh was the first of the Sikh soldiers to return to Canada. Though he had returned to action twice after recovering from wounds, in early 1917 he became ill with tuberculosis and was sent back to England, traveling on a cross-channel steamer turned hospital ship. 2 months later, he was repatriated to Canada. Seriously ill, he was transported from the hospital to the hospital ship on a stretcher. He traveled back to Canada on the hospital ship Letitia in April 1917. John Babu, wounded by a shell which broke his right leg, traveled across the English Channel on the hospital ship Panama to England in April 1917, then returned to Canada on the troop ship Saxonia in November 1917. Warriam was the third soldier to return to Canada. He came on the hospital ship Braemar Castle in December 1917, still suffering from a wounded left shoulder. Harry Singh, who had been wounded at Vimy Ridge in April 1917, was again sent to hospital due to a severe back pain in 1918. He returned to Canada on the hospital ship Neuralia in November 1918. The two men who got through the war without being wounded returned to Canada later, well after the November 1918 armistice. John Singh returned on the troop ship Canada. He seems to have returned to Winnipeg in March 1919. Sua Singh arrived back in Canada on the liner Aquitania in late June 1919 and was discharged in Vancouver, British Columbia a week later. And what did the surviving men face on their return to Canada? Nothing had changed. They had fought and suffered for Canada with all the other soldiers, yet their families were still not permitted to join them. They could still not become Canadian citizens or vote in Canadian elections. For many of the Canadian Sikh soldiers, we still know virtually nothing of their lives after the war. Did they stay in Canada or return to their families in India? Due to the restrictions on immigration from India, these men may have never gone back to India and may never have seen their families again. A painstaking search for more information on these individuals led David from the military records to census records and city directories. There he found only a few tantalizing bits of information for some of these soldiers. Warriam Singh was discharged in Victoria, British Columbia in March 1918 because of the impaired function of his wounded left shoulder. His military records give his intended place of residence as both Kapurthala, Punjab and the Vancouver Sikh Temple.
In this photograph of Victoria's Sikh temple, there is a man named Warriam Singh. Is it possible that this is the same man, or is it just another case of two men with the same name? I wonder if we will ever know.
John Singh's name only appears in the Winnipeg city directories between 1942 and 1959, as retired and living in a boarding house. There is a faint trace of John Babu's return to Victoria. He's listed as living on Bay Street in Victoria, and the elders in the community remembered him as Babu Singh.
I heard that name, is Babu Singh. He was one of the first men who joined the army in the First World War.
However, for two of these returned soldiers, Buckam Singh and Harry Singh, we know significantly more about their lives in Canada.
With the help of Sikh temples and communities across Canada, we have made some progress in solving some of the mysteries of this little story in a big war.
On Harry Singh's return to Canada in November 1918, he may have returned to his former occupation at the offices of the Canadian Courier magazine in Toronto. His occupation was listed as caretaker when he enlisted. However, he does not appear in the city directory until mid-1920s. He worked at various jobs for the Toronto Carpet Manufacturing Company, then, after retirement, worked for the Canadian Corps of Commissionaires. He died in Toronto in 1953. Suffering from tuberculosis, Buckham Singh was demobilized in August 1918 in London, Ontario. He was sent to the sanatorium in Kitchener, where he died a year later of his war-induced illness.
My initial research into the military records led to the discovery that Buckham Singh had died in Canada from his war-related injury and tuberculosis. When we discovered that he was buried at the Mount Hope Cemetery in Kitchener, Ontario, we immediately traveled to his grave in November 2007. Our visit was probably the first time that his grave had been honored since his death almost 90 years before. But that was soon to change. At the Spinning Wheel Film Festival in Toronto that winter, I discovered that Sandeep Singh Brar, an historian specializing in the Indian Army, had recently purchased a war medal belonging to Buckham Singh.
It's really quite a remarkable story, and there has to be more than coincidence to it. I think it was destiny for Buckham Singh and this medal to be reconnected with the Sikh community after a 90-year separation. I mean, you just think of all the number of medals that are out there. And I'm a collector and a historian, and I saw a medal for sale, and I purchased it thinking it was a victory medal for an Indian Army soldier, a Sikh soldier in World War I from the British Indian Army. And then when I got it, it said on the rim, it had his name, of course, but beside the rim was written Canadian Infantry, and I was like amazed. What do you mean Canadian Infantry? How could that be? There was no Sikhs fighting for Canada in World War I. And then with his regimental number, I started to do the research in Ottawa in the archives, and the story of Buckham Singh came out. This medal could have gone to any collector's collection, and they would have just noticed it as a point of interest, and no one would have ever really known about it. So it's really a remarkable set of circumstances that brought this medal and Buckham Singh back to his community.
Sandeep has since started a new tradition of a Remembrance Day service at Buckham Singh's gravesite.
Here's a great son of Punjab and a great son of Canada. So there's two stories that come together with this grave.
A recent visit to India has presented new and confirming evidence of the between Canada and India through these Canadian Sikh soldiers. When Pardeep Singh Nagra encouraged his father to visit Buckham Singh's village in India, a whole new part of this soldier's story emerged.
We actually went down to Buckham Singh's grave here in Kitchener, Waterloo, as a family, my dad, my mom, myself, and my two children, on the 90th anniversary of Buckham Singh's death in 2009. And so that really got us inspired as a family. And so what I did was equip my dad with just a simple little package. There was not much in here, just some pictures of us when we visited the grave itself and the gravesite, and just the attestation papers of Buckham Singh. And some information about Buckham Singh's village and his wife's village. And I said, this might help you or guide you a little bit. And with this little piece of information, he went on a journey and met the exact right person, a person who is married not only into the same village as Buckham Singh's wife, but into the direct family of Buckham Singh's wife.
So then finally somebody take me to that side. I meet the right guy, to give me all the information. He know more than anybody else. When he came from this group picture, the other guy also from his village. But they know he was in the army, he passed away because when they received the letter, his wife received the letter from Canadian government for the pension. And she take that letter because she don't write English, she don't read English. She take to somebody to read for me and fill up the form. So instead of fill up her name, they fill their name. And after he passed away, that his wife never get married again. And she spent her whole life in Buckham Singh village and his house. And she didn't get any financially help from nobody.
And finally, a photograph of one of the soldiers. Sent back from Vancouver over 100 years ago, this surviving image shows Buckham Singh with the other men who emigrated from his village to Canada. Mohinder's new story fits perfectly with the finding of Pritam Kaur's thumbprint on the document sent to her from Canada at the time of Buckham's death. This document asks the next of kin what the family would like to see on the soldier's official gravestone. The response of Buckham Singh's widow to the War Graves Commission confirms his Sikh faith, no cross, and Sat Sri Akal, or God is the truth. The use of a thumbprint as a signature was a common practice in India at the time, and her thumbprint on this document brings us that much closer to knowing her. Gurmit Singh of Toronto, a collector of Indian Army medals, stumbled upon a trace of another of the Canadian Sikh soldiers. A trace that was at once frustrating and shocking, yet another incredible encounter from the past.
I've come to know of a dealer in Birmingham, England, who was erasing the rims off the medals. Sadly, Lakshman Singh was one of the medals that was erased. We were in contact with the jeweler, and he had made a list of about 15 names. And what popped out for me was Lakshman Singh. You know, at the Canadian Expeditionary Force. By the time I could become in contact with the jeweler, the medal had been erased. It's basically sad because it's the legacy of the man, and once that medal is erased, it's almost like he never existed.
An important part of the story of the Canadian soldier Sikhs was a journey to the battlefields of World War I to find the graves of Sunta Gugar Singh and Lashman Singh, the two men who were killed in action. In 2010, David traveled to France and Belgium with a group of Canadian high school students to visit and document the war graves of these two men.
In the spring of 2010, we joined 21 students of Ponoka Composite High School and their teacher, Ron Labrie of Ponoka, Alberta, in their Lest We Forget school program of remembrance. Our trip first took us to World War I battlefields in Belgium. There we easily found the grave of Sunta Gugar Singh at Lalitri Military Cemetery near Kemmel, just south of Ypres. He was killed in the trenches not far from where he is buried. His grave is among those of 197 other Canadians, all from 3 infantry battalions, all buried together. Sunta Gugar Singh was excluded from Canadian citizenship, and his grave does not show the Canadian maple leaf, but he was buried with his Canadian comrades in arms. In the right grave, but his name is slightly different. Here he's Gujar Singh. In all the records, it's one name, Gugar Singh. Also, there's no Canadian maple leaf. There's no cross. So it's another surprise, another piece of the fog of war. Equally surprising was the unusual inscription for a Canadian gravestone. The script in the Gurmukhi language reads, "God is one, and victory is to God."
Sunta Gugar Singh, born in 1881 in Lahore, Punjab, India. He was a member of the 32nd Punjab Rifles for 3 years and 6 months before he joined the 24th Battalion of the Quebec Regiment. Unfortunately, he was killed in action in the trenches near Kemmel on October 19, 1915. Today, he is forever remembered as a soldier of war in the Lalitri Military Cemetery near Kemmel, Belgium. May we now bow our heads for a moment of silence in remembrance, lest we forget Sunta Gugar Singh.
From Kemmel, we moved south into France to Vimy Ridge, where Buckham Singh, Harry Singh, and John Babu all were wounded. We saw the dark tunnels and living quarters where they would have spent much of their time, and the deep shell and bomb craters that made a soldier's life so precarious. Our next ambition was to find the original gravesite of Lashman Singh and to look for clues that might help us find out how he died.
A book on the 75th Battalion suggests that Lashman Singh was killed with 4 others from his battalion when they were retreating from a night raid into German-held territory on the other side of Canal du Nord. 5 men were drowned when they were entangled in barbed wire as they tried to swim back while under fire. However, a detailed search of the death and burial records of all the men who were killed that day shows that Lashman was not one of them. It was a good story, but it was not Lashman's story. According to official war records, Lashman Singh, who was killed in action late in the war in October 1918, was originally buried in the churchyard at Balang, France, with 1 other Canadian soldier.
Would our visit to the town of Balang give us any answers to the many questions about the death of Lashman Singh? With the students, we searched the churchyard at the village of Balang in vain. There was nothing there relating to World War I graves. There was, however, a cemetery nearby. Would that be the place? The students set out to search for any memorial to Lashman Singh or any other soldiers of the war.
So probably it's the gentleman.
It was then that we were approached by 2 local men. It seemed that what we were looking for really did exist. They told us about a memorial in the village square which had something to do with Canadians. We jumped back into the bus and drove to the square with our new friend.
Mr. David Good were the 2 names, the 2 soldiers.
Celui-là?
Yeah, voilà, donc lui c'était le reportage, là c'est le soldat indien.
And there it was, a memorial to both Lashman Singh and the other Canadian soldier, until now unknown, their names inscribed together along with the local war casualties from both World Wars. Next, we set off to find Lashman Singh's final resting place, 30 kilometers away. Would we find Joseph Nadeau there too?
In the 1930s, the bodies of the 2 Canadian soldiers were reburied at the Arras Road Cemetery near Rouglincourt, France, along with over 1,000 other First World War Commonwealth soldiers.
The approach to the cemetery in itself was a very moving journey. So many cemeteries in such a small area. Finally, we arrived at the right cemetery and the right gravesite, and they were both there, and Joseph Nadeau buried side by side. After the student presentation and the rubbing of the gravestone, we placed Canadian flags and poppies from both Canada and Europe on the 2 graves. It was very moving to see the Canadian flags flying at both graves. 2 men from Canada who may have never met, but served and died close together, and are now buried together.
The little ceremony at Lashman's grave was a fitting conclusion to a long and moving search for the stories of the Canadian soldier Sikhs.